Welcome to this week's SYNNEX TD SYNNEX Microsoft Technical Series, where we rotate topics every week from modern workplace and Azure. This week, we're going to be covering an Azure topic. I'm TJ Turner, your moderator for today, one of the DSEs here for TD SYNNEX. I'm going to cover some of the administrative items before we get going. Our session is being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, you can drop at this time, and the recording link will follow after today's webinar for your on-demand viewing pleasure. If you have any questions during today's session, you can put the questions in the chat or wait till the end for our Q&A. We also ask if there's any ideas or topics that you'd like for us to cover in this series, you can put those in the chat as well. Today's session will be done by Greg covering Azure HCI. Greg?
TJ, and again, as CJ said, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today. As CJ mentioned, we're going to be covering really some hybrid solutions that Microsoft is offering to help support Azure. We've covered these topics in separate kind of sessions before, but I don't think we've done one on a weekly webinar for quite some time. But I decided that this is an extra special time to try to cover this topic because we have recently hired a new design sales engineer for TD SYNNEX that's actually going to be focused on this specific area. So a gentleman by the name of Matt Crum, he joins us actually from previously working with Microsoft for the past 24 months, focusing on the Windows Server market, the OEM market, and the Azure hybrid market. So he comes to us with a wealth of experience. So in honor of Matt joining us, I wanted to cover these topics here in our weekly webinar session to make sure that our entire audience has a good understanding of what hybrid solutions that Microsoft is bringing to bear. And as you find that there are some interest in either your account base or even in just in your organization for this, definitely reach out to your SYNNEX Microsoft account manager, and they can get you in touch with either myself or Matt, and we can start talking with you about these specific offerings and how we can help you expand your cloud services business by embracing some of that on-premises market that's still out there with many of our customer base. So with that, let's kind of get started. Obviously, it goes without saying that our customer environments and the applications they utilize are continuously evolving. We've talked about this on many different sessions, that there are just more and more apps popping up every day. And these applications are now spreading out to an even broader infrastructure base that we have to start supporting. Now, if you're in the SMB market, you may kind of go either one way or the other, where you're actually on premises and still, supporting that market segment, or your customers have made that leap and they're now, maybe fully in the cloud. But as you get into larger customers, those transitions tend to get more toward that hybrid, that they have requirements to keep some of their applications on premises, but they're also aware of the value and the agility that the cloud can bring them. So they've actually, moved at least some of their services into the cloud. And then when you move into large enterprise customers, that's almost guaranteed to be the case. But the other aspect that's also coming about, and it's nothing new about it, but is the multi-cloud approach. So that in order to try to take advantage of the best offerings from all the major cloud vendors, as well as to insulate your organization from any potential issues that may come from any one vendor, a lot of customers are looking at, deploying different solutions at all of the major clouds. So this obviously creates situations for those of us in the channel to deal with as the complexity increases through these initiatives. But what we're showing here is that, there really is a lot of interest from the customer base, especially again in those larger ones. You're seeing, some Microsoft studies they had in place showing that, especially in enterprise level customers, you're seeing, again, full 90% of them are going to remain hybrid. So you can feel relatively confident if you have that strong business, if you have that legacy capability to support these on-premises infrastructure, that there will be account bases that will be existing for the foreseeable future that will have some sort of an on-premises footprint. And those same set of organizations will most likely adopt the cloud and in a multi-cloud approach. So, there's just increased opportunity on both sides. And we're showing some of, the key drivers that are, that are the linchpins for this, that the data was built off was, again, these legacy systems or custom requirements that these customers have, that they built systems that today, either through the configuration of the system itself just doesn't lend itself to a cloud deployment, But what we also see, and I'm sure some of you have came across this, is that the vendors your customers may have chosen don't support a deployment in the cloud. So it sort of mandates that these customers have to leave some kind of a configuration and some sort of footprint on premises. One thing we used to hear a lot about is like regulations and data sovereignty, that, you know, the organizations were just concerned that their data couldn't exist off of their own physical infrastructure. But we're seeing this going away more and more. You know, most governmental and regulatory organizations are beginning to understand, and, you know, the clouds have matured to such a degree that in many cases they're far more sophisticated from a security perspective than what an on-premises deployment is. Data sovereignty, again, is less of an issue. That's normally more organizational, that customers are concerned about their data moving to the cloud. But as we've already stated, there are numerous mechanisms that are in place, and we can help educate you and your customer, if need be, on how their data can actually be better protected in the cloud. But some of those situations, again, will require customers to keep something on premises, and that will lead to this hybrid deployment. The latency and technical hurdles are things that are definitely being addressed in today's world, with more remote workers than ever. People are upgrading their bandwidth and getting the expertise they need on staff to be able to handle these configurations. But probably the biggest thing is just no proactive strategy. And I think this really got underscored as a result of the pandemic. That a lot of customers didn't have a cloud strategy. They didn't have a hybrid strategy. And then when the world shifted and the way they had to conduct business had to change, they had to look at other alternatives. And people moved into the cloud oftentimes maybe without a plan, and that is resulted potentially in a hybrid deployment because they just really didn't know how to move all their services over. But this is where we can most certainly help you as a trusted partner for your customers to get experience with all of these technologies and understand what are the options that are available to both you and your customer when you find these situations. Now, looking at some of these other capabilities that's going on here, again, as we mentioned, the on-premises environment, it's still a very healthy business. Many of you may have seen that. And part of this study is showing here, that 12 million on-premises physical servers could be growing to around 15 million by 2024. 50 to 7 million on-premises virtual machines growing to almost, upwards of almost 100 million by 2024. So there's still a lot of opportunity there. Now, most of these numbers, I will say, are probably focused on large enterprise customers. But we can help you with strategies how, as a cloud solution provider working with a partner like TD SYNNEX, we can help you still be able to get into these accounts and be able to take advantage of these opportunities. Another aspect that is continuing to grow is the use of containerization. This is something we haven't seen as much in the small to mid-market activities, but it is beginning to show there. As enterprises are moving through this adoption of containerization, this is pushing independent software vendors to start creating their applications to be more natively compatible with containerization, which is going to make them more readily accessible, to smaller customers. But this is another aspect where you, as a trusted provider, can actually help your customer, regardless of their size, become more efficient. So rather than simply taking their own premises environment and lifting it and shifting it into the cloud in a one-for-one swap out, which may or may not deliver the value proposition that you would like to deliver to your end customer, looking at the ability to containerize that environment could bring that extra value that help differentiate your offerings from your competitors. On-premises data, so using relational database management systems, that information is going to oftentimes have to stay on premises due to either those data sovereignty concerns or just the complexity of a customer's environment. But this is going to continue to grow as customers are actually delving deeper and deeper into their data, retaining more data and trying to mine the analytics out of that data to help profit their business. This is another key area where you can try to help differentiate your services by helping your customers understand how they can get value out of the data that they may have been collecting but not utilizing appropriately. And then finally is this other segment of the market that is not new, but is becoming more and more emphasized, is the hyperconverged or hyperconverged infrastructure, often referred to as HCI. This is a market segment that has been steadily growing, and there's been a few major players in the industry that have really defined this category and been seen as the industry leaders. in bringing this to bear. But if there are challenges with some of those, those initial solutions, is the expense and complexity that comes with them. So what we're going to try to show you is how you can bring this into a more manageable and controlled environment for both your organization and your end customers. So let's start looking at some of the hybrid challenges. First, we start looking at hybrid and multi-cloud. It changes everything. The way you have to handle, migration of services and the interoperability of those services, if some of them are on premises and some of them are in the cloud. Application modernization and innovation. So really, again, that goes like the containerization, but even going farther into going serverless or using microservices is the terminology. So taking an application that may have existed as a monolithic application running on premises on a Windows server, and then as you move it to the cloud, you modernize it, you actually break it into its core components, and you take advantage of everything that the cloud brings to bear to allow your customers' applications to be able to grow and to expand, and oftentimes reduce the cost of supporting those as they take advantage of these core services that are available in the cloud. The management of this infrastructure is another key area that we're going to touch base on, is that, where, this can be a challenge as you introduce complexity into yours and your customer's environment. How do you be able to consistently manage that environment effectively? Again, modernizing your data, starting to take the data and try to mine it for usefulness, while all the time meeting your governance, compliance, and security requirements of both your organization and your end customers, and potentially the industry that your end customers are part of. So this is really where we see a lot of challenges, is inconsistent implementation of governance policies. If you're not as familiar with this topic or concept, definitely reach out to your SYNNEX account manager so we can sit and have a conversation with you, specifically talking about the Microsoft model for actually implementing governance, because they have an incredible framework that's in place called the Cloud Adoption Framework that really helps you to be able to build a coherent plan that can be implemented through your organization to your end customers and ensure that there is a governance plan. But again, in these more complex environments where you start introducing hybrid, how do you actually get consistency across both your cloud environment and your own premises? Standardizing on tools that help you as a partner to your customer to help support their environment. Developing a methodology that allows for consistent and efficient management of that environment with those core capabilities like patching, backup. How do you introduce high availability and disaster recovery into that environment? And then I guess the final piece is around around purchasing, because if you're doing on premises, well, that's traditionally a CapEx, a capital expenditure. So if you're taking large amounts of money from your end customer and they have to make a large investment, they also have to, to bet on the future that they're investing in the right technology, versus the primary advantage that many customers get from the cloud, which is moving to operational expenses, so that there's only short-term investment and they can make changes very quickly as the market changes. It's one of the primary advantages people look to the cloud, is because they can get in and get out very quickly with minimal amounts of overhead that they have to work with. Where you're in a hybrid, you actually have to have a foot in both worlds and figure out how do you actually maintain this, how do you support that in a consistent manner. So getting around things like traditional licensing requirements versus subscription-based licensing that you often see in the cloud. So a few reasons, obviously, for a hybrid strategy, we've already kind of covered almost all of these at this point, but these are some of the core reasons that customers, look at a hybrid or multi-cloud strategy. How can they address these specific issues for their organization? Now let's start looking at what does it take to differentiate yourself as a hybrid cloud provider for your customer. So one aspect is making certain that you have a set of comprehensive offerings, so that when you go to your customer, you have the ability to address their specific needs. If they require something on premises, you have a portfolio of solutions. If they need it in the cloud, you understand, how to help get them from where they're at today to the cloud. If they believe they need multiple cloud iterations, you're able to have a trusted provider that you work through that can actually deliver on all those capabilities. Maybe they need to have some sort of an edge capability, that they're, need some sort of a monitoring solution that is going to leverage a key cloud capability like infrastructure or Internet of Things. or potentially even a very specific use case for disconnected scenarios where they may have to be very isolated. They're in a very remote part of the country, where they must have some sort of a solution that can function completely disconnected. The ability to maximize your investment, in the technology you already have built, with your customers, and to understand how to differentiate those offerings by accentuating them with cloud services. The ability to offer to, potentially manage services so that you can help bring the unity to your end customer, take away some of the complexity from their perspective, while you're able to still deliver a more secure environment, both on premises and across the clouds for your end customer. The ability to meet their regulatory and data sovereignty requirements through trusted, proven methodologies, as well as having a complete ecosystem of hardware vendors, software integrators, and independent software vendors that can support again, whatever the requirements for both your organization and your end customer. Now, Microsoft is really the only vendor that actually meets and checks almost every single one of these boxes. In fact, I'd be willing to say that every single aspect, you can actually find a solution from Microsoft that will be able to help you address these offerings and these requirements that may be coming from your customer base. So let's look at, how do you adopt a successful hybrid strategy? And according to Microsoft, we got these 5 phases here. The initial one is really introducing the cloud into your customer's environment. I'd be willing to bet that probably most customers have, experienced the cloud to a certain degree. And with many of our partners, this really comes about, probably with a Office 365 or Microsoft 365 or some other component. So even customers who may have been a little bit late to the game, through the pandemic and the requirements of remote work, everyone probably has been introduced into the cloud as of today. But just really showing, one of the advantages specifically of Microsoft Azure is the way in which it's implemented and the set of services that it brings and the interoperability between the other providers that are also available. So one of the aspects that you get from an Azure deployment is, again, this single control plane, this ability to have one set of infrastructure and one set of controls that are available that can reach across all of the environment. It can reach across multiple cloud vendors. It can reach across, data centers, both on premises and in the cloud, and extend all the way to the edge when necessary. Now, moving forward, start getting into the actual solutions is how do you unify this on-premises operations and management? Because this is probably one of the most challenging aspects. We've already mentioned it before, but if you have, an on-premises deployment, you have the requirements for supporting that environment, you have a need for the advanced capability that can be delivered through the cloud and the ability to go into this more operational transaction mechanism. But now you've introduced complexity into both yours and your end customer's environment. So Microsoft introduced a technology probably about 18 months ago at this point, back at their last Microsoft Inspire and Ignite conferences. This was called Azure Arc. If you're not familiar with Azure Arc, we're not going to go in depth with it today, but I will mention that this is a technology that Microsoft has delivered. Most of it is currently in general availability, with some components that are still in a public preview portion, specifically around their data structure. But the entire intent behind Microsoft Arc is to delivering that unified control plane that has existed in the Microsoft cloud for many years, and now actually extending that back into that on-premises environment through this capability that's called Azure Arc-enabled servers, that there is an agent-based capability to deploy into Windows servers, but also into things like the open source environment like Red Hat and SUSE Linux. It can also reach across into other solutions like Amazon Web Services. So if you're running virtual machines in another cloud provider, you can now actually unify those services, bring them in under management of the Microsoft framework using an Azure Arc-enabled server infrastructure. The other two solutions around SQL Server on Arc-enabled servers allows you to get that same capability to be able to reach into SQL servers that are running in that same managed infrastructure and being able to get visibility to control and secure and manage the SQL Server deployment. And then we'll keep talking about, as we move on, into other more advanced capabilities like Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes, which really empowers that containerization strategy that we mentioned earlier. So I'm going to show you just kind of a breakdown of the way this management plane looks. So what you're seeing here is sort of the general management plane that is part of the Microsoft Azure cloud experience. So there's just all these separate components, most of which you're probably quite familiar with, that have been in existence for many years now, supporting the cloud environment. So when you introduce Azure Arc, really what you're doing is you're creating a separate layer. So there's a set of interfaces that are available inside of the Microsoft Azure management portfolio and platform. And what you're able to do is, again, to take these specific components, these Arc-enabled servers and these other agent-based infrastructures, deploy them out into these remote non-Azure environments, and then they become, for all intents and purposes, the exact same set of resources, and they're managed in almost the exact same way that you would manage the native resources that are inside of Azure. So this really allows us to deliver a consistent platform. So you as a vendor for your end customer can actually have this single platform that you can unify your experience around and deliver consistency both internally for your organization so that you're able to create management paradigms and processes that are consistent no matter what that environment is. And that delivers greater value to both you that you can pass on to your end customers while also maintaining a high level of capabilities and industry excellence across the solutions that are being deployed. Now, continuing to move into the next level is around the cloud native apps and the runs anywhere services. And this is a key capability that Microsoft introduced that's called this Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes that we mentioned a moment ago. Now, if you're not familiar with Kubernetes, it is a technology. It was originally developed by Google, but is part of an open source initiative. So this technology really sort of won out at the aspect of what's called orchestration. So if you're not familiar with that, again, what it is that an orchestration platform for a container strategy is really what allows you to be able to take advantage of a tremendous amount of additional resources that may exist either on premises or in the cloud, and to be able to simplify the ability to deploy services into that what could be a relatively complex environment. So when you're thinking of containers, it's really, in its simplest form is virtualizing the application. So the same thing we did many years ago of taking a operating system like Windows Server and virtualizing it into a virtual machine. Now you go in that next step and doing something similar to what many of you may be familiar with through technologies like AppV that Microsoft introduced quite some time ago. But containers are just a next level. It's sort of like that application virtualization on steroids with a very robust infrastructure to support it. But the challenge comes is that when you create this relatively complex environment and you're needing to start up a containerized application, it's where does that application go? Which server does it land on? How many iterations of that container do you need in order to support the workload? Do you expand that environment as demand increases, but how do you reduce it to save on cost whenever the demand decreases? This is what an orchestration platform delivers, and Azure Kubernetes has really won out as an industry standard for this. Now, what we're announcing here with Arc-enabled Kubernetes is the ability to take this capability, but now be able to pull it under this single control plane and be able to deploy it anywhere. So Microsoft has introduced other services like you can see listed down below, AKS or Azure Kubernetes Services, which is a deployment of Kubernetes in the Microsoft Cloud Services. But now through Arc, you're able to bring that back down on premises and actually deploy it in any certified version or Arc validated environment that you're able to deploy in the environment. And you can see this little acronym down here, the CNCF, or that stands for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. They will certify Kubernetes distributions, and as long as they meet this compliance, then you can actually bring them under management through Arc. So that really expands your capabilities. You can deploy solutions really anywhere, and this actually allows you to reach into the largest enterprise customers or to be able to craft capabilities that will run even in some of your smallest customers, no matter where their environment is deployed, whether on premises or in the cloud. Now, Arc-enabled application services. So this gets a little bit deeper into Azure itself, and hopefully most of you are familiar with these capabilities, but if not, again, reach out to your account manager and we're happy to go into more depth with you. But you can see across the top these other Azure specific services, things like app services. If you're not familiar with those, they're more often called web apps or mobile apps, but they all fall under this branding called Azure App Services. Now, traditionally, the advantages that were brought through these platform as a service capabilities were restricted to the cloud. So if you wanted to run an Azure web app, you had to run it in the public cloud in Azure. But now through the Azure Arc enabled application services, which again is currently in preview, you actually have the capability of bringing this on premises. So if you, long as you have, again, one of those managed Kubernetes environments that we described a moment ago, you now can get the exact same advantages of having a web app running in Azure, but now it's physically running on premises on any of these managed Arc-enabled Kubernetes environment. This again allows you to have consistency of your cloud environment and on premises, and taking advantage of all the incredible capabilities that the cloud brings, so that you can bring very advanced cloud type services to your customers' on premises environment with the same simplicity of deploying it in the cloud. So all these other capabilities are again supported, Azure Functions, Logic Apps, API management, and Event Grid. And Microsoft will continue to add more and more capabilities as they expand this service. Machine learning, we've all heard about it. We've heard about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and those two terms are often interchangeable with each other in people's minds, but they really represent a very distinct capabilities. Machine learning is, as it indicates, it's the ability for the machines to figure out a process on their own. You keep loading test cases into the machine, and the machine keeps running its algorithms over and over again, looking for patterns and figuring out what are the best methodologies. So instead of you having to do classic programming to tell the machine to do in each situation, the key aspect of machine learning is the machines learn what is the best way. And then from that, artificial intelligence is generated. So machine learning is sort of the foundation for AI-based processes. Now, machine learning in the past has been only in the realms of the very largest enterprise corporations that have deep, research budgets and development labs that they could deploy. Or now it's become more commodity with the public cloud initiative, so that even smaller customers who don't have the deep budget they can afford to have incredibly complex laboratories on premises, they can actually leverage machine learning through cloud-based deployments. But as we've described before, there may be circumstances where there are data sovereignty issues and the data needs to remain on premises and you're not able to take advantage of these cloud services. So through Azure Arc, Microsoft has now brought the capability of bringing the full capabilities of Azure machine learning and executing, again, against one of those managed validated Kubernetes environments. So again, it will execute on premises and meet your customers' regulatory and data sovereignty requirements. An incredible capability that Microsoft is really, again, giving those of us in the channel a complete portfolio of solutions that we can bring to our customers to meet their needs. So continuing to look at, how do we take this, hybrid strategy to the next level? And it really gets back into data. And data is another one of those core capabilities. We mentioned it a little earlier around the ability to manage certain aspects of your customers' data when they're running a full implementation of SQL Server on a virtual machine that's being managed through Arc. But as many of you are probably also aware, just like with Azure App Services, there are advantages to taking a web app that may have been running on premises on an Internet Information Server on Windows Server and moving it up into the cloud with an Azure web app. The same thing is also true of taking your customers on premises SQL Server deployments and deploying them into the cloud through something like Azure SQL, which is another platform as a service offering. Again, just like with Azure App Services, Microsoft has introduced Azure Arc-enabled data services. So through a deployment of a supported Kubernetes environment managed through Azure Arc, you now actually have the same capability to deploy a fully managed Azure SQL database against an on-premises set of resources. And there's also, and again, that technology is currently generally available, which means it's fully supported. We're able to help you implement this at your customers today. In preview, Microsoft is also expanding this with Azure Database for Postgres SQL. So if you have customers implementing that, MySQL is also being worked on. So other non-Microsoft technologies are also going to fall into this portfolio that will be part of the Azure Arc-enabled data services. So this is just a quick, kind of an architectural diagram of how this would actually work. So you have like any piece of hardware, as long as it meets the OEM validated hardware configuration, and it can exist on just physical hardware, in this case of OEM. It could be through the Azure Stack product line that we'll be discussing, but it could also be on other public clouds like Google Cloud Platform or the Amazon Web Services. You deploy this, managed Kubernetes infrastructure we described, and then there's this concept of what's called an Azure Arc data controller. So this is sort of the brains behind it, understands where components are, but it also instruments and adds metrics into the system that interface with very common Azure services you're familiar with, things like Azure Security Center, Azure Monitor, and Azure Backup. It allows these to plug in, use these services that you've already become familiar with and understand to be able to support this environment. And again, it will deliver that data services platform that can support your customers' applications and business intelligence requirements. So let's move into the final phase of this, and I think it's really the one that kind of ties back off into part of the topic that we wanted to discuss here today, is around looking at that on-premises environment, specifically around the data center or the server rooms that you may have in your smaller customers, is how to bring, again, a more modern infrastructure and more modern capabilities to customers who require on-premises capabilities. So what Microsoft did quite some time ago is introduce a product that was referred to as Azure Stack. Many of you may be familiar with it. You may have looked into it, several years ago when Azure Stack was introduced as a product. But this was an implementation of the Azure public cloud running on premises, and it required very specific hardware, and these were sealed boxes. So they were essentially an appliance type strategy. So if you deployed 5 or more years ago an Azure Stack deployment, you had an OEM maintained solution. So even if it was deployed on premises, you're not able to open up the cage, you couldn't get in there, you couldn't touch it. It was for, again, all purposes, it was Azure, except it was a piece of Azure you could walk up and touch. It was in your data center, you had that data sovereignty requirements. But it was very complex, and it had a relatively limited set of solutions that supported initially. Well, this offering is still available, but the one thing we wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of here today is that Azure Stack is no longer a product from Microsoft, but it is now a brand. So when you hear the term Azure Stack, if you may have interacted with it in the past, you need to take a step back and look at which particular solution is being deployed, because Azure Stack, again, today is a brand, much like Azure itself is a brand. So under the Azure Stack brand, there are now 3 products. Azure Stack Hub, which is the solution you were formerly familiar with. So it was the product formerly called Azure Stack, is now Azure Stack Hub, and this is an identical solution to what we've described before. Also, on the other side, there's Azure Stack Edge. So this is, again, an edge solution, and then in the stack in the middle is the Azure Stack HCI for hyperconverged infrastructure solution. So when we start looking at these particular products, so again, Azure Stack Hub provides that core value proposition that we described. So you have customers that require advanced capabilities running on premises. They need a completely autonomous cloud so that it's essentially maintained and managed by your vendors. So this is a key differentiator with Azure Stack Hub, is that from the customer's perspective, the physical hardware exists in their data center, but they have no responsibilities for managing and maintaining it. If anything happens with that, they contact their vendor or through their service provider like yourself, and the vendor will maintain this solution. It gives a consistent application environment between the public cloud of Azure and the Azure Stack deployment on premises, and they're often very purpose-built integrated systems from the OEM provider of your choice. They allow you to deliver a connected or a disconnected cloud. So one example of Azure Stack Hub that I think kind of emphasizes where its usefulness, and one of its early implementations that I personally am familiar with, was on a cruise ship. If you think of the way the cruise ships work, is that they're, for the most part, if they're making money, they're out at sea servicing their customers, but they often come into ports which they can actually connect to landline services. But they wanted to build advanced solutions to support their guests, and they wanted to build these off cloud-based technologies. However, when the ship was at sea, they couldn't get reliable data connections to have everything work properly. So by deploying an Azure Stack Hub on premises, they were able to deploy those key capabilities to support their operations. And then whenever they put into port, which was oftentimes every just a couple of days or so, they're able to connect to high-speed internet services. They would synchronize everything, pull down new updates. They had this little piece of the cloud that they were able to take with them. Other scenarios you sometimes hear are more associated with the military, where they have very protected environments. But it could be even, corporations or even your customers, that they need to have an environment that's completely disconnected, and that is another supported use case for Azure Stack Hub. but it's primarily designed to meet these regulatory and data sovereignty requirements when they're incredibly strict. And it allows customers to deploy a modern application strategy even when they have these very strict requirements on their organization of how they can control and maintain their data and the services they provide to their customers. So Azure Stack Edge, as we introduced a moment ago, is an edge solution. Its primary goal is to bring things like the Internet of Things to bear. And this solution is slightly different than the other two products in the fact that it is a first-party delivered solution where Microsoft is partnered with a hardware vendor to be able to deliver a Microsoft Azure Stack Edge branded solution. And again, the idea is to take this out to the edge so that you can deploy IoT management paradigm so that you can allow local command and control to happen to support those remote environments. So this is primarily to support edge computing. It can run things like the cloud storage gateway where you can have storage on that edge that still connects in, is supported and managed to the cloud. And it is a fully Azure managed appliance type implementation. But the solution we really want to focus in on today and with our audience is around this other offering called Azure Stack HCI, which again stands for Hyper-Converged Infrastructure. This is where I think there is a gold mine for those of us in the channel to be able to literally go in and find all of these nuggets that exist inside of your customer base and to be able to start taking advantage of these specific use cases where maybe the cloud is not a good fit. They need to keep things on premises, but they don't want to manage their old classic type infrastructure with the high level of administrative requirements and the disconnected nature from the rest of their organization. So Azure Stack HCI is a key component for a hybrid operation. It allows for software-defined infrastructure. So you use cloud mentality, cloud management paradigms to be able to manage your own premises infrastructure. And it runs on what's referred to as validated solutions, which we'll discuss in a little bit more. But basically, it's not a custom engineered solution like Azure Stack Hub, but it is commodity hardware that's simply been validated to be able to support the requirements for a solution like Azure Stack HCI. Azure Stack HCI is collected to the cloud, so it uses the exact same management infrastructure we've discussed before, including capabilities like Azure Arc. It allows for consolidated server infrastructure, whether you have all your servers on premises in a single location or scattered across multiple locations. And it allows you to, again, deploy a strategy for refreshing aging hardware with a more modern solution. So let's look at one of these implementations here. So this is actually just showing all the different components here. So Azure Stack HCI is, again, what we're going to try to focus in on more depth. So just take a moment to talk about what hyperconvergence is. So again, we kick this terminology around a good bit, and many of you are probably familiar with it. But really what differentiates a hyperconverged infrastructure solution is going back almost to the best practices of the data centers a couple, few years ago or a decade ago, when you think you had a rack-based system and you actually started going with best-of-breed solutions. So you had best-of-breed compute, best-of-breed networking infrastructure, and best-of-breed storage. So go back a couple of decades, you had a box that had everything in one, but they didn't always interoperate and function at the highest level. So the specialization became the trend for quite some time, and these different systems were put racked up so that they were physically close to each other, but still disconnected. So what certain vendors decided to do is that there were some advantages in this model of having essentially best-of-breed systems built for their specific function, but now they could actually deploy it in a single chassis. So it's almost going back to the way things were, but with a modern approach to the way you architected the solution. Now, what really differentiated a hyperconverged infrastructure from just a hardware-only solution is that they built all of this on top of a hypervisor, thus the hyperconverged, that you had the physical hardware that's always required, but instead of having an operating system running natively on the physical hardware, you had this management plane, aka something incredibly similar to what you could think of we described before with Azure. So this layer, this foundation that would run on the physical hardware and provide what again looks very similar to cloud services, but all of this running on a piece of hardware you have on premises. So what Microsoft realized is they had all of these capabilities in-house, and they have had them in-house for quite some time. And they were able to take advantage of solutions they already had in market to be able to deliver this. So they're able to take this hyper-converged infrastructure, marry it with the cloud management platform in Azure that you're already familiar with, and be able to deliver, this need that was actually emerging in many customers of all sizes, whether they're the largest of enterprises or the smallest SMBs. There was actually a strategy where this would actually work. Now, when you combine the capabilities that we discussed with Azure Stack HCI with the previous capabilities around Azure Arc, hopefully you can start seeing where this all comes together into a perfect solution to where you're able to take bits and pieces of the cloud, run them on commodity hardware on premises, and then wrap it all around this single management paradigm that uses cloud-based technology but leverages on-premises components. So you're looking at Azure Stack HCI. Again, it's a flexible infrastructure designed to deliver these Azure hybrid services. So it should be your go-to solution whenever you're realizing a customer has any type of an on-premises component they need to work with. And again, it really marries back into the cloud. And this is one of the other changes that Microsoft made back in December of last year, was really introducing this complete cloud management strategy. So a couple years ago, when Microsoft started going down this path, they kept their foot in both worlds. They still used a Windows Server licensing paradigm, but trying to deploy it as a management component for the cloud, which, again, those two worlds didn't work as well with each other. And again, it still introduced that operational expenditure against the capital expenditure. So what Microsoft has actually done in the most recent iteration of Azure Stack HCI is using a complete cloud-based strategy for managing this environment. So there's still an upfront purchase of the hardware, but many OEM vendors have came up with subscription-based methodologies to actually purchase the hardware. So you continue in that operational expenditure methodology while using complete cloud-based solutions to be able to deploy the capabilities. So a modern Azure Stack HCI deployment requires an Azure cloud subscription, and it is utilized for the billing of anything deployed into that on-premises implementation. So this Azure integration, again, truly gives you the best of both worlds. You're able to have the Azure portal management paradigm that so many of us are familiar with, along with the on-premises deployment that will meet specific workload requirements for your end customers. Now, the way when you start looking at the on-premises environment, because there is this on-premises component, so you manage a lot of the infrastructure and capabilities through the Azure management portal, but there's still that on-premises component. So how is that piece managed? And this is, again, through another technology that most of you are probably quite familiar with and that Microsoft introduced many years ago, called the Windows Admin Center. So Azure Stack HCI now has used this as its primary interface. And if you've used Windows Admin Center, you're probably aware that for the past several years, Microsoft has been integrating capabilities of this public cloud into Windows Admin Center. So even if you take a piece of commodity hardware and you install just a regular Windows Server operating system on it, and you use Windows Admin Center for your administration, you've been able to tie it to the public cloud and use things like Azure Backup or Azure File Sync. You can take System Security Center and Azure Update Management and allow it to go against this on-premises environment. Well, obviously the same is true, but this is now the primary and really the only management experience that Azure Stack HCI delivers. So with these capabilities, you're really able to deliver the best of both worlds. So you're able to have that, on-premises footprint. You have that complete capability from a management experience. You're able to deliver with, again, the best-in-class virtualization host. Hyper-V is the core component that underlies not only Azure Stack HCI and Windows Server, but it is the building block of Azure itself. So again, it's a well-proven technology. The applications, run, inside of guest operating systems inside of Azure Stack HCI. So the paradigm on premises is an environment that you're very familiar with. The main change is the underlying operating system that's providing this capability. In the past, you may have done it either with a native Windows Server operating system in Hyper-V, or potentially with a third-party solution like VMware or Citrix XenServer. So now you're able to do this again with a single vendor and a single solution with this consistent management paradigm. You can run it on your hardware, and again, it can run absolutely anywhere. So these are just a couple of deployment scenarios. that you can, look at what's called an Azure Stack HCI integrated system. So this is sort of the peak of the pyramid when you're looking at ease of deployment. And this is very close to an appliance-like strategy. So we've all probably purchased hardware-based appliances in the past that come with pre-installed software environments to be able to manage whatever the environment is. So I've seen backup servers, I've seen storage appliances, you name it. There's a lot of solutions that take this capability. So Microsoft has worked with its OEM vendors to produce Azure Stack HCI integrated systems. These come with the operating system pre-installed, and it's as close to turnkey as possible. You drop ship this into a location, you hook it up, and you just configure it. But for those who need more capabilities and more flexibility, you can also look at the Azure Stack HCI validated nodes. And this goes back to what we discussed before. You take a piece of hardware that's gone through a certification process with Microsoft and validated that it can support Azure Stack HCI workloads. But in your case, you would actually have to deploy this solution, or you can work with a trusted vendor like TD SYNNEX, and we could assist you with the deployment of this technology on whatever particular hardware configuration you want. So obviously in this validated nodes, you have a broader selection of hardware, both vendors and equipment to choose from, where Azure Stack HCI integrated systems might be better if you have remote facilities with minimal IT staff and you need to ship a known working solution out to them with the exact same value propositions that we've discussed up to this point. So I think this is actually just going to go into more detail about those two offerings. So I guess I jumped the gun a little bit in my description. So you can see here in this particular component, it really just goes through and explains the specific ways of which these two environments are similar, but also how they differentiate from each other. Now, as we've discussed, there are a lot of different options to choose from. So you can have remote office or branch office type configuration through your OEM vendor. There are still these edge compute scenarios. So there are vendors who specialize in those particular areas. If you have larger customers with data centers, but they're wanting to modernize to more cloud-based management infrastructure and mentalities, you can go with these same vendors and have, rackable systems that are designed to go into your customers' data centers, and again, complete workload flexibility across the many different OEM partners Microsoft works with and the different value of the systems in which they can offer you. Now, looking at, again, a complete deployment, this is really just showing you where everything falls into. So across the bottom, obviously, is the hardware ecosystem that's required, and there's currently over 200 solutions that Microsoft has identified that are validated and supported for Azure Stack HCI. You have the Azure Stack HCI itself, which again is that foundational technology of which you can build virtual machines or that wealth of other services we described that are built on top of something like Azure Kubernetes service. This is so where those data services, machine learning, cognitive services, or just regular containerization. And then on top of all of that, obviously runs the application that drives your customer's business. And then you can see over to the left, you're able to use all of those core capabilities that Azure has differentiated itself with a consistent management interface, either of the Microsoft Azure Management Portal or the Windows Admin Center for local administration. So here we're just showing, like I said, this is the we mentioned this before, but I want to mention that Azure Kubernetes Services itself is one of those supported workloads that you can actually run on premises for your customer. So you can actually take solutions that may have been built in the public cloud using Azure Kubernetes Services and then actually deploy them back on premises through a certified configuration with Azure Stack HCI. So this is a unique offering that only can be delivered through Azure Stack HCI and Microsoft. So I'm going to get ready to start wrapping things up here. I got a list of resources. So this deck will be made available to you. You'll be able to go download it, click on these different links and follow. But if you got a quick finger, you can actually probably do it at the moment, because since I'm using PowerPoint Live inside of Microsoft Teams at the moment, each and every one of these links is actually live, and you can click on them and go to those sites right now. So if something is interest to you, definitely go click on those links so that you can get those windows opened up on your side. And then for those of you who want to wait to afterwards, you can wait until we make this presentation content available to you, of which you can actually take advantage of all of these resources. And again, as always, remember that we're always here for you at TD SYNNEX, so you can always reach back out to your account team to get more information and assistance with any of these opportunities and offerings. The other thing that's make sure that I want to highlight is, again, where Microsoft themselves is being here to help support this initiative. And one of the primary ways they do this is through their learning capabilities they made available. So if you're not familiar with Microsoft Learn, you definitely need to take advantage of it. But if this particular topic is of interest to you, go out and look at these other operations that are available as part of Microsoft Learn for the Azure Stack HCI Foundations, which will talk about all the technologies in more depth than what I was able to cover today, as well as the ability to operate and maintain those environments once you have them deployed. Here's other capabilities for getting started. How do you, these are some of just the scenarios that exist of how you unify the operations. How do you run data from your customer anywhere in a consistent environment? Managing Kubernetes, modernizing the data center, extending VMware workloads into the cloud. So there are capabilities to be able to take, if your customer has an invested on-premises commitment to VMware, we can talk about strategies of how that can be extended to take advantage of the Azure public cloud through the Azure VMware Solutions offering. You can extend your compute and artificial intelligence out, to the edge using these technologies, and implement a hybrid networking environment for your particular customer. So finally, there's just flexibility to basically do anything and everything through the combination of all these particular technologies. So since we're kind of wrapping things up again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I would also, again, at this point in time, be able to open it up for questions. So if anyone has any questions, since everyone's mic is currently muted, we'd request as you use the Teams functionality to raise your hand. If you're not familiar with this, across the top of your screen, you should see an option that has a smiley face with a hand raised. If you hover over that, you should see another option that will be a hand with the palm facing you. If you click on that, that will raise your hand, and that will indicate that we should be able to take you off mute. But while we're waiting for people to think of their questions, I'm going to invite our new design sales engineer, Matt Crum, to come off mute and introduce himself as well, and he could help me with answering any potential questions that we might have. So with that, we'll ask Matt to speak a few words.
Hi, thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for joining today. I really look forward to working with all of you in the future. I think that I think what Greg pointed out today is the flexibility that we have with Azure Stack HCI. It really meets a lot of different requirements and use cases in those instances that you have customers that still need to run on-prem workloads. In the past, you would probably sell some Azure services for those cloud deployments, and then you might throw it over the fence to a hardware seller to sell them some type of on-prem solution if they needed that. Now we can do this all in one. They're billed straight through their Azure subscription for Azure Stack HCI. They don't need to buy a guest OS unless they're going to run Windows Server workloads. It truly does meet a number of needs in that space when you need to have on-premises servers.
Yep. And I see, Matt, where you've already been answering a lot of questions in the window, but there's one last one that hadn't been responded to yet, so I'll give you the chance to discuss this one. But it says, is the price the same for Azure Stack HCI, I guess, is in the cloud? So can you maybe take just a moment and discuss the differences between the way that Azure Stack HCI is licensed versus
Sure.
Azure Cloud?
Yeah. So actually, Microsoft made it very simple when it comes to pricing Azure Stack HCI. If you're familiar at all with how Microsoft has priced Windows Server in the past, where they moved to this core-based licensing model. And so, depending on the number of physical cores in the server would determine how many cores of licensing you would need for Windows Server. And they took that same licensing model and applied it to Azure Stack HCI. So as part of the Azure subscription, what a customer will pay for is $10 per core per month. What we generally see are, 12 to 24 core server nodes. So let's just assume that, you've got two 24 core nodes. They're going to pay $480 a month for Azure Stack HCI, in addition to any other cloud services that they may be utilizing through Azure. So it's a very simple model. We get, again, no longer this one-time license fee associated with this OS. It now is moved to that subscription model, making it very easy to predict their ongoing cost.
Yep. Thank you very much. And again, the other thing that I would like to just try to end today's, at least our portion of today's session with, is around that this really opens up, again, all those other opportunities in front of you. You know, we've been talking the cloud for quite some time, and we still believe that it is the best destination for most of your customers. But be aware that there now is a unified solution to where you can take advantage of those on-premises deployments. So if you have customers that are still got on-premises footprint, this could be the actual capability that you can actually deliver to them that will give them this cloud-based model while allowing them to continue with the comfort level that they may have for being on premises. So again, with that, I will put my final request of everyone is to definitely reach out to your Microsoft account representative. If you don't know who that is, use the email address on the screen for Microsoft CSP at SYNNEX.com. That will get you to our services team, and they will find the right individual for you. So I look forward to working with everyone in the future. And at this point in time, I'm going to stop the recording. And I don't see any hands up yet, but feel free to raise your hands, and we're more than happy to